What you think about corrupt systems that never change? This is the story of one man who didn't just fight back, he transformed an entire police department. It was a sunny afternoon at the park. The place was full of life, kids laughing, joggers passing by, and birds chirping in the trees. On a bench near the pond, a young black man named Marcus Wright sat quietly. He wasn't doing much, just enjoying the day and lost in his own thoughts. He wore a simple hoodie and jeans, blending into the scene like anyone else. But not everyone saw it that way. In a park patrol car, two officers, Daniels and Fisher, watched him closely. Daniels leaned forward and squinted. "What's he doing here? Looks out of place, doesn't he?" Fisher chuckled, already judging Marcus without knowing a thing about him. They got out of the car and walked up to him. Their questions came fast and sharp, starting with a demand for ID. When Marcus asked why, they didn't give him a real answer. Instead, they made comments about his clothes and where he was sitting, making it clear they didn't trust him. Daniels even potted him down while Fisher stood there smirking. Marcus didn't fight back or raise his voice. "Is this how you treat everyone?" Marcus asked. His voice was calm, but you could hear the edge in it. They ignored him, acting like he didn't matter. What they didn't know was this wasn't just some random guy. Marcus had a lot more going on than they could guess. Later that evening, Marcus was back at home, sitting in front of his laptop. Tomorrow was his first day as the new chief of police. The job meant everything to him. Head worked hard to get there, pushing through every barrier that had been thrown in his way. But tonight, all he could think about was what happened at the park. He stared at his reflection in the mirror as he adjusted his tie. "Those guys have no idea," he said to himself. He wasn't angry, not exactly. But he couldn't just let it slide either. He opened his laptop and started typing out notes for the precinct meeting head lead in the morning. Marcus wasn't looking for revenge. That wasn't his style. But he knew something had to change. This wasn't just about two officers who crossed a line. It was about fixing a system that let them act that way in the first place. And he was ready to make it happen, no matter how hard it got. The next morning, Marcus walked into the precinct with his head held high. The building buzzed with the usual morning chaos, phones ringing, officers talking, and the hum of computers in the background. Marcus' presence didn't draw much attention at first. In his crisp uniform, he blended right in. Daniels and Fisher were at their desks, laughing about something. When Marcus walked past, they barely looked up. He reached the meeting room, where the precinct staff was already gathered. A senior officer, Captain Morales, greeted him warmly. Morales was one of the few people in the room who knew who Marcus really was. When everyone had settled, Marcus stepped up to the front. He took a moment to scan the room. Some officers looked curious, others indifferent. Daniels and Fisher sat near the back, scrolling on their phones, clearly not paying attention. "Good morning," Marcus began. His voice was calm but firm. "My name is Marcus Wright. As of today, I am your new chief of police." The room went quiet. Daniels and Fisher's heads shot up, their faces a mix of surprise and disbelief. Marcus paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I'm here to make this department better," he continued. "But that means we're going to have some tough conversations. Things need to change, and it starts with us." Marcus' words hung in the air. The officers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others looking uneasy. Daniels and Fisher avoided his gaze entirely. Marcus knew this was just the beginning, but he was ready for the challenge ahead. After the meeting, Marcus called a smaller group of senior officers into his office. Captain Morales was among them. They discussed the issues plaguing the department: racial profiling, excessive force complaints, and a lack of community trust. Marcus listened carefully, taking notes as the officers spoke. "We've had these problems for years," Morales admitted, "but no one's really done anything about it. Marcus leaned back in his chair. That changes now. We're not just going to talk about fixing things. We're going to do it. Morales nodded, but a younger officer, Sergeant Blake, looked skeptical. With all due respect, Chief, change isn't going to be easy. Some people won't like it. Marcus smiled faintly. I didn't take this job because it was easy. I took it because it matters. And trust me, Sergeant, I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make a difference. The room fell silent. Marcus' determination was clear. As the meeting ended, Morales lingered behind. Chief, if there's anything you need, let me know. I'm on your side, he said. Thanks, Morales, Marcus replied. I'll need all the help I can get. As Morales left, Marcus leaned back in his chair, thinking about the road ahead. He knew the changes he wanted to make wouldn't happen overnight, but he was ready to fight for them. It was time to show the department what true leadership looked like. Marcus spent the rest of the week reviewing files and familiarizing himself with the precinct's operations. It didn't take long to see where things had gone wrong. Patterns of misconduct, ignored complaints, and a lack of accountability were all there in black and white. It wasn't just 2 or 3 bad apples, the whole culture needed a shift. By Friday, Marcus called another meeting. This time, it was mandatory for all officers, including Daniels and Fisher. He started by addressing the elephant in the room. Let's talk about trust, he said. Or more specifically, why this community doesn't trust us. The room was silent. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus continued, We're here to serve and protect, but how can we do that when people are afraid of us? When they don't feel safe calling for help? Daniels raised his hand. With all due respect, Chief, most of us are just doing our jobs. You can't blame us for a few bad incidents. Marcus met his gaze. You're right, Daniels. Most of you are doing your jobs. But doing the bare minimum isn't enough anymore. We're going to raise the standard. And that means looking at ourselves first. Marcus announced new training sessions focused on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and community engagement. Some officers groaned, but Marcus didn't waver. This isn't optional, he said firmly. If you're not willing to grow, this isn't the place for you. Daniels and Fisher exchanged uneasy glances. Marcus noticed, but said nothing. Change was never easy, but he knew it was necessary. And he wasn't going to back down. The following week, Marcus decided to take things a step further. He arranged for a community forum at a local rec center. The idea was simple. Bring residents and officers together to talk openly about their experiences. It was a risky move, but Marcus knew it was the only way to start rebuilding trust. The room was packed. Residents sat on one side, officers on the other. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus stood at the front, his presence commanding but approachable. Thank you all for coming, he began. This isn't going to be easy, but it's necessary. We need to hear each other out. One by one, residents shared their stories. A mother spoke about her son being unfairly stopped and searched. A shop owner talked about being treated like a suspect in his own store. The officers listened, some shifting uncomfortably, others genuinely moved. Then it was the officer's turn. Fisher surprised everyone by standing up. I'll be honest, he said. I never thought about how my actions might come across. Hearing these stories, it makes me think. I'm sorry for anyone I've hurt. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Marcus closed the meeting with a promise. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. But we'll get there, together. Encouraged by the forum, Marcus wasted no time implementing his next initiative. He introduced a zero-tolerance policy for any misconduct within the department. Officers who violated the rules would face immediate consequences, no exceptions. Some officers grumbled about the changes, but Marcus didn't budge. He knew that if he wanted respect from the community, It had to start with accountability within the department. The next day, Daniels and Fisher found themselves called into Marcus' office. They looked uneasy as they sat across from him. Marcus didn't mince words. "You've been on my radar since day one," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Your behavior at the park was unacceptable. That's not how we treat people." Daniels crossed his arms. "With all due respect, Chief, we were just doing our job." Marcus leaned forward, meeting Daniels' eyes. "If that's what you think your job is, you're in the wrong line of work." He handed them both a written warning, the first step in a progressive discipline process. "This isn't personal. It's about doing what's right. If you're willing to learn and grow, there's a place for you here. If not, this isn't the department for you." Daniels and Fisher left the office, their expressions a mix of anger and uncertainty. Marcus watched them go, knowing he had just drawn a line in the sand. It was up to them to decide which side they wanted to stand on. Weeks passed, and the effects of Marcus' policies began to show. Officers who once resisted were slowly coming around. Community complaints had decreased, and people began to speak positively about the department for the first time in years. But not everyone was on board. Daniels, in particular, continued to push back. Had developed a reputation as a troublemaker, but Marcus refused to give up on him. One afternoon, Marcus called Daniels into his office. "Daniels, let's be honest," Marcus said. "You've been here a long time, but it feels like you're fighting me every step of the way." "Why?" Daniels hesitated. "Chief, I've been in this job for 15 years. I've seen things. And honestly, I don't think the changes you're making will stick." Marcus leaned back. "I get it. Change is hard, and it's scary. But the question is, are you willing to try? Because I think you have it in you to be better." Daniels didn't respond right away. For the first time, he seemed to genuinely consider Marcus' words. It was a small moment, but Marcus knew it could be the start of something bigger. Daniels wasn't the only one struggling with change. Several other officers had been resistant, but the shift in culture was undeniable. Younger officers were embracing the new standards, and community leaders were beginning to praise the department. Marcus' persistence was paying off, but he knew there was still work to do. Daniels began showing up to the new training sessions, albeit reluctantly. He didn't say much, but he listened. One session focused on de-escalation techniques, and Marcus led it himself. He shared examples of times he had faced tough situations without resorting to force. His stories were practical, not preachy, and they resonated with some of the officers. After the session, Daniels approached Marcus. "That example you gave," Daniels started. "The one about the domestic dispute. How did you stay so calm?" Marcus smiled. "It's not always easy, but it's about remembering why we're here. We're not just enforcers. We're problem solvers. If we can fix a situation without making it worse, we should." Daniels nodded, his usual defensiveness absent. It was a small step, but it felt significant. Marcus didn't press further. He knew change took time, and he was willing to wait as long as progress continued. The turning point for the precinct came sooner than expected. Late one evening, a high-profile case landed on Marcus' desk. A local business owner had accused several officers of racial bias during an investigation. The media quickly picked up the story, and tensions in the community were at an all-time high. Marcus called an emergency meeting. "This is a defining moment for us," he told the room. "How we handle this will either rebuild trust or destroy it completely." Daniels, to Marcus' surprise, volunteered to lead the internal investigation. "He'll make sure it's fair," he said, his voice steady. For the first time, Daniels seemed genuinely committed to change. Marcus nodded, trusting him to handle it responsibly. The investigation uncovered gaps in procedure but no malicious intent. Marcus held a press conference to address the findings and shared a plan to prevent similar incidents in the future. His transparency earned praise from the community, and Daniel's role in the investigation didn't go unnoticed. It was a victory, but Marcus knew there was still work to be done. The investigation's success brought a newfound sense of purpose to the precinct. Marcus could see the shift in how officers interacted with the community. Officers like Fisher had started taking the new training seriously, applying de-escalation techniques during tense situations. Even Daniels, who had been one of Marcus' toughest critics, seemed to find value in the new direction. But change wasn't without resistance. A few officers still clung to the old ways, seeing Marcus' reforms as a challenge to their authority. One morning, a disgruntled officer openly questioned Marcus' leadership during a briefing. "All these changes, Chief. Do you really think it'll matter in the long run?" Marcus paused, letting the room's attention settle on him. "Every change matters," he said calmly, "because every life we impact, for better or worse, matters. If you're here just to punch the clock, then this isn't the place for you. But if you're here to make a difference, you're in the right room." The officer didn't reply, but Marcus' words seemed to linger. Over time, even the most resistant officers couldn't ignore the positive feedback from the community. Marcus' leadership was proving that accountability and compassion could coexist in law enforcement. One of Marcus' biggest goals was strengthening ties between the precinct and the community. He introduced a new initiative, monthly neighborhood patrols, where officers would walk the streets without their cars, talking to residents and listening to their concerns. It was a small step, but it had a big impact. During one of these patrols, Marcus joined Daniels and Fisher as they walked through a neighborhood. At first, the residents were hesitant to engage. But as the officers continued to listen and showed genuine interest, barriers started to break down. One resident, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter, approached Marcus. "Chief, I've lived here for 40 years. It's been a long time since I've seen officers walking these streets like this." "Thank you." Marcus smiled. "We're here to do more than just enforce laws, Mom. We're here to build trust." The patrols became a monthly tradition, creating a ripple effect that strengthened relationships across the city. The community felt seen, and the officers began to see the people they served as more than just statistics. As the precinct made strides toward progress, Marcus knew he needed to address a deeper issue: the systemic racism that had plagued the department for years. He organized a department-wide forum where officers and community leaders could openly discuss the impact of racial bias. The forum wasn't easy. Some officers were defensive, while others listened with quiet discomfort. One speaker, a local activist named James, shared his experiences with police harassment. "It's not just about individual officers," he said. "It's about a system that's failed us over and over again." Marcus stood up after James finished. "He's right," Marcus said. "We're not just fixing individual actions here. We're rebuilding trust in an entire system. And that starts with us owning our mistakes." The forum ended with a sense of resolve. Officers began to understand that acknowledging the past wasn't about blame, it was about building a better future. Marcus' transparency set a precedent for honest communication. The precinct's transformation didn't go unnoticed. News outlets began covering the department's progress, highlighting Marcus' leadership. But with the attention came scrutiny. Critics questioned whether the changes were sustainable or just temporary improvements. Marcus welcomed the scrutiny. He invited journalists to shadow officers during their patrols, showing the public the work being done firsthand. "Transparency is key," he told his team. "If we're doing the right thing, we have nothing to hide." One of the journalists, a young reporter named Elise, followed Marcus for a day. She saw firsthand how he handled interactions with the community and his own officers. At the end of the day, Elise said, "Chief, I came here expecting to find cracks in the story. But honestly, what I see is real change." The journalist's stories painted a picture of a department on the mend. Officers like Daniels and Fisher, once symbols of resistance, became examples of change. Their willingness to adapt and grow inspired others, both within the precinct and in the community. A year after Marcus took over as chief, the precinct had become a model for reform. Complaints had dropped, community trust was at an all-time high, and officers felt proud of the work they were doing. Marcus knew there was still work to be done, but he also knew the department was on the right path. During a ceremony celebrating the precinct's progress, Marcus addressed the crowd. "This isn't about me," he said. "This is about us. Every officer, every community member, everyone who believes in doing the right thing. Change isn't easy, but it's always worth it." As Marcus looked out at the faces in the crowd, he saw something he hadn't seen before: hope. The precinct's journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were moving forward together. In the end, Marcus knew the most important legacy he could leave wasn't just a reformed department. It was the belief that change is possible when people come together with a shared purpose. Subscribe for more stories like this. Please note this is not a real story. It's a work of fiction only for education and entertainment purpose.